The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban street. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and warm pavement, a perfect Saturday afternoon. Mark sat on his porch, cradling a mug of coffee, letting the moment of peace settle over him like a well-worn blanket. It wasn't often he had the luxury of simply existing in the calm, but today was different. Laughter rang out from the sidewalk in front of his house, bright and unrestrained. His kids, Liam and Sophie, were sprawled out on the concrete, hands covered in dust as they filled the gray pavement with streaks of color. Swirls of pink, blue, and yellow spread out in playful patterns. Flowers, stars, and what looked like an ambitious attempt at a unicorn. Mark smiled. These were the moments he lived for, the unfiltered joy of childhood, the simple magic of creativity. His kids weren't glued to screens or bickering over toys. They were lost in their world, weaving something beautiful out of nothing but imagination and chalk. Then came the shadow. A throat cleared, a sharp, deliberate sound meant to slice through the moment. Mark didn't need to look up to know who it was. The rigid posture, the perfectly pressed blouse, the ever-present clipboard tucked under her arm, it could only be her. Karen. The self-appointed ruler of the HOA, whose sole purpose in life seemed to be making others miserable in the name of neighborhood standards. She stood at the edge of his property, arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. Her lips pursed into a thin, judgmental line as her eyes swept over the sidewalk, her gaze practically burning holes into the chalky artwork beneath her feet. Mark exhaled through his nose, already bracing himself. "Mark," she said, her voice clipped, each syllable a carefully measured dose of irritation. "We need to talk." Liam and Sophie paused mid-doodle, their hands frozen over their masterpiece. Sophie, her pigtails swaying, looked up at Mark with wide eyes. He offered a reassuring nod before standing and making his way to the edge of the porch. "Afternoon, Karen." He kept his tone neutral, casual, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. She sniffed, gesturing stiffly toward the sidewalk. "This is against HOA regulations." Mark arched an eyebrow. "Chalk. Asterisk defacement asterisk," she corrected, like the word itself was distasteful. "It lowers the property value. This is a community, Mark, not a carnival." Mark let out a short, incredulous laugh. "They're kids. It washes off." Karen's nostrils flared. "Rules exist for a reason. If we allow this, what's next? Graffiti? Decline? Chaos?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, biting back his annoyance. He had seen this play out before. Karen thrived on control, wielding her HOA status like a badge of authority. He had no doubt she had been watching from her window, waiting for an excuse to descend upon his front yard with righteous indignation. "They're just playing, Karen," he said evenly. "Give it an hour, and the wind will probably do your job for you." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not the point." She straightened, her expression hardening. "I'm giving you a warning. Either clean it up immediately or—" She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she pulled out her phone and, with a dramatic flourish, began tapping at the screen. Mark felt his stomach tighten. "Or what?" Karen didn't even look up. "Or I'll call the police." Silence. Liam and Sophie froze, the innocent joy of their game evaporating into thin air. Sophie gripped her chalk, her tiny fingers smudging the color against her palm. Liam, older, more aware, glanced up at his father, waiting for some reassurance that this was just an empty threat. Mark felt heat rise in his chest. This was beyond ridiculous. It was absurd. A grown woman calling the police on children for chalk drawings? It should have been laughable, but the look on Karen's face was anything but humorous. She was serious. "You can't be serious," Mark said, his voice low, measured. Karen met his gaze with a triumphant glint in her eyes. "I am serious." She lifted the phone to her ear, turning slightly away. "Yes, I'd like to report an act of vandalism." Mark exhaled sharply, clenching his jaw as his fists curled at his sides. He could argue. He could tell her exactly what he thought of her pathetic power trip. He could laugh in her face, tell her she had finally lost whatever remained of her common sense. But then he saw his kids. Sophie shrinking against the pavement, her once bright expression now marred with confusion. Liam pressing his lips into a firm line, trying to be brave. And just like that, the anger drained from Mark, replaced by something colder. Sharper. Fine. If she wanted to play this game, he'd let her. Karen turned back, smug. "They're on their way." Mark crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "All right." Her smirk faltered. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." He leaned casually against the porch railing. "We'll wait." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but she masked it quickly, schooling her features into a look of forced satisfaction. She gave one final pointed glance at the sidewalk before turning on her heel and marching back toward her house, disappearing behind her perfectly trimmed hedges. Mark let out a slow breath. Liam looked up at him. "Are we in trouble?" Mark crouched down, ruffling his son's hair. "No, buddy." He glanced toward the street, toward the distant wail of an approaching siren. "But she might be." The distant wail of sirens cut through the air, a sound that normally signaled real emergencies, accidents, burglaries, actual crimes. But today they were responding to something far more ludicrous. Mark stood with his arms crossed, his jaw set, as the police cruiser rolled down the quiet suburban street, its flashing lights bouncing off the pristine driveways and neatly trimmed lawns. Liam and Sophie had abandoned their chalk, standing stiffly at his side, their small hands curled into anxious fists. Sophie leaned into him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his jeans. Liam, attempting a mask of bravery, squared his shoulders, but Mark could feel the unease rolling off him. Across the street, Karen stood like a queen before her castle, her expression a picture of smug satisfaction. She had positioned herself at the edge of her driveway, waiting, arms folded, her lips pursed in a self-satisfied smirk. The cruiser came to a slow halt and two officers stepped out. The first was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a steady presence, his badge catching the sunlight. His name tag read Daniels. The second officer, leaner and younger, scanned the area with a furrowed brow as if already regretting being assigned to this call. Mark exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. Karen wasted no time. She marched toward the officers with purpose, her heels clicking against the pavement like a judge preparing to hand down a verdict. "Thank goodness you're here," she began, her voice laced with authority. "I called about an act of vandalism." Right there, she jabbed a perfectly manicured finger toward the sidewalk. "It's completely unacceptable." Officer Daniels followed her gaze, his expression unreadable as he observed the crime scene in question. A series of pastel-colored doodles sprawling across the pavement. Flowers, rainbows, a few smiling stick figures. A lopsided sun with a beaming face. The supposed evidence of destruction. He blinked. "Ma'am," Daniels said carefully, "you called about vandalism?" Karen's expression tightened. "Yes. The HOA has strict regulations against defacing community property, and this," she gestured dramatically toward the chalk drawings as though she were presenting Exhibit A in a high-profile trial, "violates those rules. It sets a bad precedent. If we let this go unchecked, next thing you know people will think they can do whatever they want." The younger officer, whose name tag read Reed, exchanged a glance with his partner. Mark didn't miss the barely concealed flicker of exasperation that passed between them. Daniels turned toward Mark, his posture easing. "Sir, you live here?" Mark gave a single nod. "Yep. These are my kids." He placed a hand on Liam's shoulder, feeling his son relax slightly under his touch. "They were just playing. It's sidewalk chalk. It'll be gone with the next rain." Daniels exhaled through his nose, shifting his weight. He looked back at Karen. "Ma'am, this isn't vandalism." Karen recoiled as though he'd just insulted her. "Excuse me? There's no crime here," he clarified. "Sidewalk chalk is temporary. It's not damaging property. It's literally designed to wash away." Karen's face reddened. "That's not the point. Rules exist for a reason. If we don't enforce them, people will start thinking they can just ignore them." Officer Reed sighed, clearly growing impatient. "Ma'am, we handle real vandalism. Graffiti. Property damage. This." He motioned toward the drawings, his voice edged with disbelief. "This is kids being kids." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She hadn't expected resistance. She had anticipated swift compliance, maybe even a fine or a scolding to throw back in Mark's face. Instead, she was being dismissed, by the very authorities she had weaponized. Mark fought back a smirk. "This is ridiculous," Karen hissed, her composure slipping. "Are you saying you won't do anything about this blatant disregard for rules?" Daniels crossed his arms, unimpressed. "I am saying that." Karen's breath hitched. "Well, I want to speak to your superior." Daniels arched a brow. "Ma'am, I am the superior." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Sophie tugged gently on Mark's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered. "Are we in trouble?" Mark crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No, sweetheart," he murmured. "We're not." Karen, desperate to regain control, doubled down. I want them issued a warning at the very least. Daniels exhaled through his nose, clearly done with the conversation. Ma'am, I'll give you a warning instead. Karen blinked. What? Wasting police resources on personal vendettas is a real offense, he said smoothly. If you keep calling us for non-issues, that could be considered filing a false report. Karen paled. That's absurd. I was enforcing the rules. Officer Reed, barely containing his amusement, shrugged. Well, the rules don't apply to the law, ma'am. And the law says these kids did nothing wrong. Karen's lips pressed together in a tight line. This isn't over, she snapped. Daniels glanced back at Mark. Sir, you have a nice day. Then, in a tone that was just a little too casual to be accidental, he added, nice artwork, by the way. Sophie's eyes widened. You like it? Daniels grinned. Sure do. Keep up the good work, kid. Karen let out a strangled noise of outrage, but Mark barely noticed. He was too busy watching his daughter's face light up, the worry melting away as the officers returned to their car. As the cruiser pulled away, Karen stormed back toward her house, muttering under her breath. Mark didn't need to hear her words to know she was seething. The battle had ended. But the war? That was just getting started. The neighborhood had settled back into its usual rhythm, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. Karen had slunk back into her house, humiliated yet undoubtedly plotting her next move. Mark could feel it. The woman thrived on control, and having the police dismiss her so publicly had wounded her pride. She wouldn't let it go. The confirmation came the next morning. Mark stepped onto his porch with a fresh cup of coffee, only to find an official-looking notice taped to his mailbox. He ripped it off, scanning the bold letters at the top. HOA violation notice, his jaw clenched. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you have engaged in activities that violate community standards, specifically the defacement of public property. Per HOA regulations, you are required to remove any unauthorized markings immediately. Failure to comply will result in fines and further action. Asterisk asterisk. This is your only warning. Mark exhaled slowly, gripping the paper so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't over. Inside, his kids were still eating breakfast, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. He wasn't about to ruin their morning over this nonsense, but he wasn't about to roll over either. If Karen thought she could use bureaucracy to get her way, she was about to find out she had underestimated him. He grabbed his phone and snapped a picture of the letter before heading inside. The next few hours were a flurry of research. Mark combed through the HOA bylaws, scanning for anything that justified Karen's absurd claims. What he found was exactly what he suspected. There were no rules prohibiting temporary sidewalk chalk. Karen had overstepped, banking on intimidation rather than facts. Armed with this knowledge, Mark took the next step. He logged into the neighborhood's online forum, a place usually reserved for garage sale announcements and passive-aggressive complaints about untrimmed hedges. Today it would serve a different purpose. He drafted his post carefully. Good morning, neighbors. As many of you know, my kids were recently playing with sidewalk chalk outside our home. Apparently, this was so egregious that the police were called. Now, I've received an official HOA violation notice demanding I remove the drawings and warning of fines. However, after reviewing the bylaws, I found no rule against temporary chalk art. I wanted to bring this to everyone's attention because I believe we should all be aware when HOA leadership starts making up rules as they go. Has anyone else experienced something similar? He hit post and waited. It didn't take long for the responses to pour in. Asterisk, are you serious? My kids do it all the time. Asterisk, Karen is on a power trip. She tried to fine us last year for having a flower pot in the wrong shade of beige. Asterisk, this is ridiculous. We need to do something about her. Mark leaned back, satisfied. The fire had been lit. By the afternoon, the discussion had exploded. Neighbors who had stayed silent before were now sharing their grievances. Unjust fines, arbitrary rule changes, Karen's general reign of terror. The HOA board, once a faceless entity, was now under scrutiny. Then came the real kicker. A neighbor named Rachel chimed in with a screenshot of a text message she had received from Karen earlier that morning. Asterisk, we need to enforce stricter rules before this neighborhood starts looking like a circus. I want to set an example with the chalk incident, so if you back me on this, I'll make sure your recent landscaping violation disappears. Mark grinned. Karen had overplayed her hand. The backlash was swift. People weren't just annoyed now, they were furious. By evening, a new petition was circulating. Vote to remove Karen from the HOA board. Mark had never seen something gain momentum so fast. It was clear, the neighborhood was done being ruled by an iron-fisted tyrant. As he refreshed the page, watching the signatures climb, he heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking up his driveway. Showtime. Mark set his phone down just as the sharp, deliberate click of Karen's heels echoed up his driveway. He took a steadying breath, suppressing the smirk threatening to form. She was here to do damage control, but she was already too late. The neighborhood had spoken, and this time Karen wasn't the one calling the shots. She appeared at the foot of his porch, her arms folded, her expression tight with forced composure. But Mark could see the tension in her rigid posture, the barely restrained fury simmering beneath her polished exterior. "We need to talk." Mark leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Do we?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I saw your little post." "Hard to miss," he said. People had a lot to say. Her nostrils flared. "You're turning the neighborhood against me over chalk? That's petty." Mark let out a short, humorless laugh. "No, you turned the neighborhood against you by trying to control everyone with made-up rules. The chalk was just the last straw." Karen's carefully constructed mask slipped for a fraction of a second, her jaw tightening before she forced a brittle smile. "Let's be reasonable, Mark. You don't want to start a war you can't win." He raised an eyebrow. "A war? I thought this was about enforcing community standards." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "This petition? It's childish. The HOA board won't take it seriously." Mark tilted his head. "I don't know, Karen. It's already got over 100 signatures, and last I checked, that's more than enough for a formal review." Karen stiffened. She had counted on her authority being unquestioned, but now the weight of the entire neighborhood was against her. She took a step closer. "Listen," she said, lowering her voice. "I'll make you a deal. I'll rescind your violation notice, and in return, you call off this ridiculous mutiny." Mark scoffed. "Let me get this straight. You threatened me with bogus fines, tried to get the police involved, sent an entire HOA violation just to prove a point, and now that people are holding you accountable, I'm supposed to back down?" Karen's eyes flashed. "I'm giving you an out. Take it." Mark pushed off the doorframe, stepping down onto the porch, closing the space between them. "No, Karen. You take it." He nodded toward the growing thread of angry neighbors on the forum. "Because whether you like it or not, you've lost." For the first time, Karen looked unsure. Mark continued, his voice calm but firm. "The board meeting is in 2 days. People are showing up and they're not happy. If you step down now, quietly, you might salvage some dignity. But if you fight this, you're going to lose in front of everyone." Karen's fingers curled into her palms. Her mind was working, calculating, looking for an angle where she still had control. But there wasn't one. Not this time. She let out a slow breath, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her blouse. "Fine," she said at last, her voice clipped. "I'll consider it." Mark nodded. "You do that." Karen turned sharply on her heel, marching back down the driveway, but there was no victory in her stride this time. 2 days later, the board meeting was packed. More people had shown up than anyone had expected, their voices loud and their demands louder. Karen barely spoke. She didn't argue, didn't fight, because she knew there was nothing left to fight for. By the end of the night, the vote was in. Karen was out. As Mark walked home, Liam and Sophie skipping ahead, he looked up at the sky. A light rain had started to fall, dotting the pavement. By morning, the last of the chalk would be gone. But the mark Karen left on this neighborhood? That was washed away long before.